Author Henry Lawson led a largely itinerant life. He wandered from the Blue Mountains to Sydney, then Western Australia seeking work. In 1891, he found his only full-time writing job in Brisbane with The Boomerang. That year, Lawson wrote a story that captured the quintessential Australian characteristic: mateship. Published as a poem and prose, the story showed how far Aussies would go for their friends. Big Jack Dale.
It was during harvest in a western district of New South Wales. And a broiling hot day it was too, when Big Jack Dale, riding like a madman through the bush, jumped the fence and the wood heap and brought his horse to a standstill at the door of a little farm homestead where the men were sitting down at their 4 o'clock meal in the large, cool kitchen. "Hello, Jack. What's in the wind now?" cried the selector, while his daughter hurried, all smiles, to place an extra plate and stool for the newcomer. To the surprise of all, instead of dismounting and answering in his usual jovial manner, Jack leaned his arm against the eaves of the bark roof and, resting his forehead on his hand, sobbed like a great child. They sprung to their feet like a man, with consternation in every face, for now they knew that something serious was the matter. Jack did not keep them long in suspense. He turned a haggard, woebegone face towards the company and blurted out, "Dan Denver's dead. Killed this morning, thrown from his horse. Funeral tomorrow from the Talbragar Inn." With that he wheeled his horse about and galloped off through the scrub, muttering now and then something like the following words: "Dan shall have the biggest funeral in the West, if I know it." On he rode to the next farm, and then to the station, and then to the Teamsters' camping ground, shouting at each place, "Dan Denver's dead. Killed this morning. Thrown from his horse. Funeral tomorrow. Talbragar Inn." The sun went down and the moon rose, throwing countless false tracks through the bush, and still the rider went on. He had borrowed a fresh horse at the last station and now rode harder than ever. Solitary teamsters on the main roads, lonely selectors in the scrub, stockmen and shearers in the men's huts on neighbouring stations, inmates of sleeping farmhouses, and even small parties of prospectors in the range were roused by the clatter and crash of hoofs and heard the same cry: "Dan Denver's dead. Killed this morning, thrown from his horse. Funeral tomorrow, Talbragar Inn." Morning drew near, and Big Jack Dale was still riding within his circle of 20 miles in diameter, while from all points of the compass, bushwomen and bushmen on horseback, in carts and drays, and even on foot, were making for the old Talbragar Inn to pay their last respects to Dan Denver, the best known and best liked stockman in the West. And all his friends drew consolation from the conviction that he would have the biggest funeral, the biggest in the West, if Jack Dale knew it. Just before daybreak, Jack turned into the bridle track which led through the scrub to Coonawarra Station. The moonlight still threw its long false tracks through the trees, but the rider did not blunder an inch from his way, for he knew the bush. Across the track, just below Dead Man's Gap, lay a newly felled white box tree, the trunk of which looked like a streak of moonlight falling through the branches overhead. There was the sound like the blow of a maul on the wedge, a thud and a crash, and horse and rider lay an indistinguishable heap at the bottom of the ravine. Dan Denver had the biggest funeral ever known in those parts, but to the surprise of everybody, Jack Dale was absent. No one dreamed for a moment that such a rider as he could meet with an accident, and the general opinion was that Jack lay beastly drunk at some shanty, dead to all sense of decency, while his poor friend was being carried to his grave. His weakness was well known, but with all his faults, it was not thought that he could sink so low as to get drunk on an occasion like this, for he and poor Denver had been chums since childhood. But Jack not turning up next day, a search was made for him, and they found the dead horse and dying rider among the ferns and rocks in the hollow beneath Dead Man's Gap. Being dosed with half a pint of his favourite drink, brandy, Jack opened his eyes and made a vain endeavour to collect his shattered wits. Then he said with great effort, "Dan Denver's dead. Killed yesterday. Thrown. He gave it best for a minute or so, but it was plain to see that there was still something on his mind. He had another try, and at last got it out. "Funeral starts from Talbragar Inn tomorrow." Then he relapsed into unconsciousness. The party stripped a sheet of bark from a neighbouring tree, lifted poor Jack gently onto it, and carried him to the station. There was some more breakneck riding that night for medical assistance, but as Jack said himself during a sensible moment, they might save their wind. He was sensible just before he died and asked only one question. Did Dan have a big funeral? They told him yes, and he smiled, or rather grinned, and closed his eyes, satisfied that he'd done his best for Dan Denver.